Good morning all and welcome to today's webinar. Today we're looking at lessons learned from the New Relic DevOps journey. This is our second webinar in the DevOps series. The first webinar took place about a week and a half ago. If you're interested in looking at recording, you can log on to our website and have a look at the previous webinars. And I'm sure you've already received an invite for that webinar. So before I hand you over to today's presenter, I just want to cover some housekeeping. So today's session is being recorded. So if you got to leave early or if you had a colleague who wanted to attend, don't worry. We will be sending out a link to that recording and it will be available on newrelic.com. Also, because we have so many people online today, everyone's on mute, just to make it clear, and our presenter Neil can run through it smoothly. If you have any questions, I do encourage you to pop them into the questions panel as we go through today's session. And then lastly, at the very end, we do appreciate your feedback. So there is a quick survey at the end where you can give your feedback if you have any ideas for additional topics that you'd like to see us covered. And also if you want to sign up for a free New Relic trial, you have the option of doing that within the survey. So I'd like to hand you over to today's presenter, Neil McGowan. So Neil, if you want to unmute your line and you can take it away, please.
Thanks, David. Good morning, everyone. First of all, what I'd like to do is just quickly run through the agenda for the session that we've got today. What we're going to be covering in this session is a little bit about, what is and why is DevOps from our perspective at New Relic. We're then going to look at three key stages on our journey, our DevOps journey, and what that entails in a little bit more detail. And then we're going to look at specifically 5 lessons that were learnt on the road during those 3 key stages. And we can follow that up with a question and answer session at the end. And as David said, if you can pop your questions into the questions panel on the webinar, we should be able to cover most of those at the end. And if we can't, then we can also follow up if we know who's asked the question directly via email, etc. A little bit about me. That's my self-portrait, obviously. My name's Neil McGowan. I'm the Director of Digital Intelligence at New Relic in EMEA, which basically means that I cover the entire region, working with customers to help better understand how New Relic can drive their business outcomes, how we can help them to achieve their goals using our platform to get out there faster, more reliable, higher quality solutions to their customers and to manage them effectively using the New Relic technology. Looking back to my past, I originally started in line of business, so a user of technology, and then moved into software development. I subsequently moved into ISV organizations on the testing side of the house, then the APM side of the house, predictive analytics, ITSM, and so on, and now I'm at New Relic. So I've seen pretty much every role that there is in terms of the delivery of software to support a business, and I bring that perspective to how we can help other organizations achieve the same. So let's begin. First of all, what is DevOps? Well, it's certainly a topic. A lot of people are talking about it. It's a topic which is gaining a high degree of interest over the years. You can see here that in terms of the interest with regard to DevOps as a topic compared to systems administration as a topic, DevOps has been gaining ground and systems admin has been losing ground. And we're now at the point basically where it's starting to overtake the more traditional systems administration topic. And that's becoming prevalent across companies ranging from small startups right the way through to global enterprises. So it's interesting to try and understand what's driving that interest in this particular topic. And fundamentally, what it is it's the demands of the consumer world that we live in, the digital world that we live in. Customers are wanting anytime, anywhere access to products and services. They're looking for rapid innovation and change. the rate at which organizations are delivering new offerings, services, and functionality is accelerating all the time, and competition is fierce. So in order to keep up, organizations, whether they're traditional bricks and mortar organizations or they're digital-only startups, they're having to adopt approaches which allow them to get their solutions, their technologies, their offerings out to market faster and to continue to innovate. And this is basically what's happening to businesses worldwide. They need to embrace this digital revolution in order to compete, survive, and thrive. And New Relic is no different to any other organization. That's what we had to do in order to establish ourselves in this particular business. And as I said, it's happening to organizations large and small across the globe, and digital transformation has been a hot topic for a while. Many organizations have been adding the role of the chief digital officer or extending the role of the CIO to address the challenges of meeting these demands within their IT organizations. Yet, most interestingly, really, it's not about having a digital strategy within a business for IT. It's more about having a business strategy for a digital world, as was recently quoted by the CIO of HelloSearch.com. And this is what is driving organizations towards DevOps as a way to enable the delivery of their business strategy. So if we look at who's adopting DevOps, well, the enterprise accounts across the globe, more than 80% of those are adopting DevOps in one way or another. And that might be that they're adopting it company-wide. So they're trying to transform the whole organization, or it could be within a particular business unit, something which I see quite a lot, especially if you have organizations which have quite a large legacy operations and infrastructure organization, that they're building new business units with a DevOps approach from scratch. Or it may be just down to specific projects or teams where they're trying this approach. But the future is definitely moving down the DevOps path, regardless of the size or scale of your organization. So what exactly is DevOps? It means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. It sounds like a wonderful, magical thing that will make everything faster, better, cheaper, that will help drive innovation, drive revenue, customer retention, and customer satisfaction. But let's dig into a little bit more detail as to what exactly DevOps is and is not. And please remember that these are just the views of New Relic in this case. And if you have any questions about these, please feel free to ask them. But one thing that DevOps is a methodology. It's an approach to delivering high-quality software in a fast-paced, modern environment. It's not a job or a team title. You don't hire a DevOps person as such. You don't have a specific DevOps team. That's like hiring an agile person. It's a methodology. It's a way by which you deliver an end product. One thing it also is a mindset. It's something that you need to get everybody bought into, to understand a way of working, so that they're all aligned. It's not a particular process. It's not like an ITIL process that needs to be followed. It's just a mindset of a collaborative activity with a shared common goal. Another thing that we think it is an organizational attitude. It requires, the whole organization, or if it's a business unit, to be on board with this and have a can-do, a yes methodology approach to getting things done. It's not an end to itself. In other words, it's not necessarily a destination. You don't become DevOps. You just actually become bought into this approach and this attitude, this way of doing things. And it's about getting to yes. So always looking at the ways that things can be done, how we can achieve whatever the business is trying to achieve, how we can be positive in helping them move forward It's not a set of technologies or tools that specifically enable DevOps. There are technologies out there which help with this process, but you can't buy DevOps. It's about the things that we've already mentioned about getting the mindset, the attitude, and having the methodology that gets you to that yes point. And finally, it's about a way of organizing teams, and this is fundamentally what we'll be covering in this presentation. It's how do you organize your teams so that they can work in this collaborative way to deliver what's required. And it's not about necessarily getting to a certified DevOps state. It's not, it's, if you like, a destination. It's more of a journey. So to sum it up, what exactly is DevOps? Well, it's a way of being able to do business differently. It's a way of being able to manage the business services that you require and enabling you to create a collection of organizational and cultural changes that enable you to address the unique demands of building the software that you need in today's world. And it's also a way, I suppose, of resolving a long-standing conflict. So, in the traditional world, there is a conflict that exists between the development organization that's seeking to ship new releases, new functionality, new features, new products to achieve highly aggressive goals. And they're rushing forwards with this leading edge approach. And yet, on the other side of the fence, you've got the operations team, which is seeking stability. They like their sleep. They don't like change. Change is the thing which causes them to lose sleep and to miss their SLAs and to have difficult conversations with the business as to why things aren't working or why they're not performing. So you have this natural conflict between people trying to introduce radical change into an environment where people dislike change. But it goes beyond just the conflict between development and operations. There's a much wider conflict, and that conflict includes operations, tests, and support. They too seek the stability. They seek, reducing risk in the environment. I talked about my background, and I remember as coming from the business into development, I remember thinking, well, what does this line of code actually mean to the business? That's why I was brought into that role. But when you look at it from the testing perspective, you could have a discussion with a developer that says, look, if I can't test it, then you can't write it, okay? Because if I can't test it, it's going no further. Similarly, from a deployment perspective, if we can't deploy it, then there's no point writing it at all. And from a management perspective in production, if we can't manage it, then there's no way you can put it in our environment. So you have this resistance from the operations, test, and support organization to anything which introduces uncertainty into their environment. And yet on the other side of the fence, you've got the product owners, the business, and the developers trying to go full steam ahead with new innovations, new technology, new offerings to help drive the business forward. And this, causes a real challenge between the two sides of the organization. So how does that, manifest itself? Well, if you imagine the business, the product, and the development organization as wanting to create a fantastic experience. Yeah, they're wanting to create something which the customers will love, and it will delight them. So they come up with this menu, this fantastic meal, which is going to blow the customers away. And they don't want to wait either. They don't want their customers to have to sit and wait for hours for the next course, etc. So everything is going at a rapid pace to ensure that the customer gets the best possible experience. But the problem with that is that this is the experience that the customer is expected to receive, but somebody in the background, has to go and clean up the mess afterwards and has to try and manage that and deliver that. And there's very little, connectivity between those, and typically there's a whole host of problems which have to be dealt with in terms of trying to deliver that amazing experience. So wouldn't it be better if you just started working together, as if you cleaned up as you went along? You worked in terms of, yes, delivering that fantastic experience, that fantastic menu, if you like, for your customer, but at the same time, you're making sure that you're creating a scalable, clean, safe environment within which to deliver and manage those applications ongoing. And that's really where New Relic started from. It was about trying to create something which was more joined up and more focused on delighting the customer while still being able to deliver that on an ongoing basis. So, what was New Relic's recipe? And that's really where we're going to start to come into, how did we do it? What did we do? And what were some of the lessons that we learned in terms of creating that amazing experience? So first of all, if we start at the beginning, not necessarily the beginning, the New Relic had been around for a while, but before 2012, before we actually started to look at this approach, there was some prehistory, if you like. We had a traditional IT operations group that was primarily concerned with the servers, the telephones, believe it or not, and the networking and the Wi-Fi and all of those sorts of things. And they were pretty much on call for everything. Didn't matter whether it was, a problem with the Wi-Fi or a telephone, or it was one of our applications that we were delivering to our many customers. So they were on call for everything. They didn't even do the deployments. The development organization, the product teams did the deployments, but they were responsible for the applications once they were there. And they didn't really understand the needs of the application. They were just very much focused on the underlying technologies. And I suppose this could be quite common of a lot of organizations, either a few years ago or even today, that there's this disconnect between what the applications are actually doing and the operational infrastructure that's supporting those. So in 2012, what happened was New Relic created a new organization called Site Engineering. This organization was a breakout group from the traditional IT operations organization. This organization was no longer responsible for the phones or the offices. It was just focused on the application delivery and reliability. There was a separate IT operations organization that looked after all of the other stuff. But this small team, and it was a small team, it was only around 5 or 6 individuals, was put together with much more of a focus around the application delivery. And even back then, if you said, okay, well, we were doing DevOps, it was more because this team comprised of programmers that were doing operations. Okay, so we hired individuals that had programming backgrounds and understood what the applications were actually doing, so that they could become an enabler to the business. They wanted to be able to help the product teams deliver radical change and to be able to support that. But it was, it was more about doing DevOps by accident, I suppose, or dipping your toe in, simply because we were building a small team of developers that could make things happen in the operations space in support of what we were trying to achieve. But this was just the first step on a long road of organizational change as the organization grew. But what did we learn basically on this first stage when we created this particular team of site engineers? Well, the first thing that we learned really was to set the right pattern early. Okay, If you're small, then you can take the plunge early. You have far less friction. It's a lot easier to change your organization if you're small. It enables you basically to identify, whether or not you're already doing some things which may fall into DevOps. You might already be on the right path, but you can also do things like avoid creating silos, avoid creating unnecessary specialties within the organization. So try and foster a culture that is all about sharing, democratizing data, working together for a common goal. And you've got the freedom and the flexibility to do that if you're a small organization. You haven't got all of those ingrained years of experience of doing things a certain way that you have to try and break down the resistance to this approach. So that was the first lesson learned. That if you are small, then you can set the right patterns early. Now you may say, okay, well, what if we're not small? What if we're a big organization? Well, I think that's where you start to see some of the things that we saw on the previous slide, is where large enterprise organizations are adopting DevOps within a particular business unit, or they're adopting it within a particular project. So they're trying to create that culture and organizational structure to support that specific need in a smaller context than in the whole. So the second lesson that we learned as well during the first stage was that your infrastructure can be a force multiplier. It's not a barrier. It should be something which you should leverage and that can actually help you achieve more. The people that run the infrastructure, they understand what's possible and what's not. They understand what's cheap and what's expensive. So, get them involved, because you can allow them to be an asset to the team. They can help you understand the costs, the risks, and the rewards of doing certain things within your organization. So eliminate, if you like, the department of no, right? In the past, it was no, you can't do this, no, you can't do that. One of the reasons, because change is bad, but it's getting them to start to think about what they can do. Okay, so and the way that you do that is by incentivizing them correctly. Okay, if all you do is you incentivize your operations team based upon availability, then that's all they care about. And there might be some added value in changing the incentives so that it's more focused towards business goals, and then you can happily weigh up the risk and the reward associated with doing certain things. Yes, it might possibly introduce a little bit more instability into the environment, but it's something that the business needs to do in order to achieve its goals. Let's get these people involved and understand the associated risk and reward. And the other thing that you can do if you engage with the infrastructure team is they can actually drive innovation as well. Innovation from operations, because that's what they do. I mean, they're good at getting more for less. They're good at improving efficiency, driving greater performance, etc. And they can become as much of an asset to you in terms of what you deliver to your customers as the development organization. So, wouldn't it be great, for example, if we could offer our services with much greater performance at no extra cost? Or wouldn't it be great if we could offer our customers greater storage, 10 times the amount of storage for their data at no extra cost? And that's what the IT operations team can bring to your business. So that was the second major lesson learned, basically, was that you need to engage with that team and use them as an asset in terms of delivering what you need as a business. So stage two, we got a few more engineers. This was a couple of years later, where the engineering organization was growing at a steady rate in scale and tempo. And what we discovered at this point was that there were a few things that we needed to do. we needed to try and address the stuff that was difficult to do and make the people that were best placed to fix it responsible for it. So, one of the things we were discovering at this particular point in time was that, although most of the teams were responsible for doing their own deployments, a lot of these were manual and labor intensive, and they were only doing them, one deployment a week, for example, and that deployment was taking pretty much one engineer day for each deployment. And as we grew as a company, as we grew as an organization, and as our portfolio grew, this was just not scalable, right? It was just taking too much time. So what we did was we forced the development organization and the product teams to deploy more often. We said, okay, well, we want you to deploy twice a week. We want you to deploy every day. And what that basically did was focus the minds of those individuals on how they could make this process much more efficient, much more reliable, much more scalable. And it's amazing how necessity drives innovation, and that's how we achieved a lot of the gains in terms of our operational efficiency, was through putting it into the hands of the product teams. One of the other things that we did was that we put all of the teams on call for their own services. Okay. I'll come into this a little bit more detail on the next lesson that we learned, but we rolled this out fairly slowly. We started with the most operationally savvy teams, and we didn't throw them under the bus, right? We didn't say, okay, you go ahead, you've got to look after that. We had to put our house in order. So we had to make sure that they had the right access, that they could get to the right data, that there was good documentation, proper escalation paths, and a clearly defined process. And one of the things that we implemented as part of the process was enabling them to interact through Slack or similar, using chatbots to help the process along. But they always had that ability to reach back out into site engineering to guide them through the process. But why did we do that? Well, fundamentally, putting people on call is really giving them ownership, right? It's amazing what the prospect of losing sleep drives from behaviors. Thinking back to that slide where we had the fantastic meal that was prepared. If you've got no vision of the mess which is created behind you, then you'll merrily go ahead creating wonderful dishes. But the moment you say, come on, it's your turn to do the washing up, then people start thinking differently. A developer, every line of code that he writes, if he thinks that line of code could wake him up at 3 a.m. on a weekend, then he might think differently about the quality of that particular line of code. So what does the prospect of losing sleep drive? Well, it drives better code in the first place, higher quality, smoother deployments as well. So making sure that everything is deployed correctly, and that you're not introducing problems into the system. It drives improved documentation as well, so that everybody understands what's going on, and you don't have to be calling on the same experts every time to get a view as to what's happening. It drives automation, whether it's from a deployment perspective or potentially a resolution perspective, and run books so that other people can handle what's going on. But fundamentally, it drives best practice. It drives an approach which enables everybody to be focused on the availability, performance, reliability, scalability, and quality of the applications that you're delivering. So that was lesson 3. But you have to be careful, okay? It's one thing to alert people, but you need to make sure that you alert the right people, and you alert them for the right things. So one of the things that we did was we set about managing that effectively. So we started to make sure that we were tracking the right incidents. We were ruthlessly trying to remove noise so that we weren't waking people up every 5 minutes in the middle of the night, and that if they did get something, that it meant that there was actually something really wrong and that they had to do something about it. And there's this link here shows you some information about how we're using PagerDuty, and here's a view of some of the things that we're doing with PagerDuty in terms of monitoring the number of incidents which are being dealt with, who's dealing with them, what teams, and so on. And some of the things that we did with this data, first of all, was to try and make sure that we weren't overloading certain people, that we weren't causing a problem. But secondly, you can use it for recognition purposes. If you wanted to, you could create awards. Who dealt with the most incidents or who had the least incidents because everything was so good, and do some sort of recognition within the organization along those lines. Alongside that, in terms of protecting the sleep, I mentioned earlier about interacting with Slack using bots and so on. So this link here talks about how to manage your incidents in a process that everybody can follow. This is an external one, but what we're seeing more and more is that when you start to adopt this approach, that you're getting slightly away from the traditional incident problem change process and getting much more involved in a ChatOps scenario where people are collaborating, communicating in real time, looking at the same data to resolve an issue with a highly focused group. And that's one of the things that we definitely endorse and deliver. So lesson 4, as part of stage 2, was to transform the product teams, basically. And what do we mean by that? Well, we needed to distribute the expertise. So we didn't just, as we grew, we didn't just have more data and more services. We had too many more. Still, the team at this point was fairly small. We were looking, sort of like 10 to 12 people in site engineering. And that wasn't enough to manage, 10 to 12 services, let alone the number that we were actually starting to manage. And we recognized that having the team isolated wasn't the way forward. So what we needed to do was to break up, if you like, that site engineering group. And we started to create a matrix-managed team of site reliability engineers and put them into the forward SRE position within the product groups. And this is something that Google did. So by embedding, if you like, a site reliability engineer into a product team. Now that product team might have multiple projects, etc. That team has a director. That director was responsible for assigning where the forward SRE would work, but they were still centrally managed, but sort of like loaned out to these teams, etc. And what they did was they brought their expertise around operations into that team, which they all benefited from. But additionally, they helped them navigate through an organization that was becoming increasingly large and complex. And it helped them break through the barriers or the walls that existed, even though they shouldn't really exist. But it helped them to, escalate and move things forward more effectively in an increasingly complex organization. So that was lesson 4, was putting this skill into the product team and helping that product team specifically achieve its goals. So finally, stage 3, world domination. This is where our organization became incredibly large from a development perspective. 500 plus engineers. We looked at this doing a shuffling of the deck, if you like. This was the beginning of last year, spring 2016. We shuffled the deck, And what we did was we recognized that we'd become too big to have a centrally managed team for site reliability. And so what we did was we decided that we should put the site reliability engineers directly into the product teams. So the product teams were able to hire and allocate for these positions themselves. This position became a peer to the software engineer, so an integral part of the team. And became an incredible asset to the team. Naturally, there's a bunching up of operational focus groups. So the site reliability engineers, they have a community, they communicate together, they share knowledge on particular areas of focus, but they are embedded within the product teams, and they're bringing that knowledge and that expertise to the benefit of the product team that they're working within. As I said, they also have specific interest groups, and they drive interest group activities rather than a specific reporting line for the SREs as a whole. They are part of the product team as opposed to we learned basically was that the organization was going to have to become a complex entity, if you like, a biological entity, and that entity had to consist of small teams which had full ownership for everything that they needed to do, right down to the level that they needed to do it. So basically, they had the ability to engage as far down as the stack as necessary. They didn't necessarily have to, go right the way down to infrastructure components or specific database technologies if they didn't need to, but if they did, then that's where the team should go. So giving them full ownership, and what that means is that where they interacted with other services, that might be through an API with an SLA attached, or some other agreement where they're handing off to another service, but where their ownership needs to extend to is defined specifically by what it is that they're trying to achieve. Now, I suppose you could say that this is the true aspect of DevOps. You're putting everything into a single team, but by keeping that team small, you're capturing the energy and the rapid response stance of a traditional startup organization. So if you like, what you're looking at within New Relic is dozens of startups that are all working admittedly on a shared common platform and common goal, but they have that same energy, enthusiasm, that can-do attitude, and they have the access to the resources that they need in order to get things done. Now, I mentioned Google earlier when we talked about stage 2, where we created a site engineering team, and from that team we put site reliability experts out on loan as forward SREs to the various product teams. This is one step further from that. This is, putting those site reliability experts actually in that team and not being centrally managed. Now, Google don't do that. They haven't gone down that route. And this might be one step too far for a lot of organizations who still want to have some control. And from a Google perspective, it may be due down to the complexity of their infrastructure, the scale of their organization, that they need to have some aspect of central management. And in fact, it's the SREs which are on call for the applications that they deliver, rather than the product owners and the development teams within Google. But this is the way that we've gone. It might not be right for everyone, but that's that's where we are. So as a result of that, New Relic has been able to rapidly build a platform that is becoming the first best place to look to understand our customers' digital businesses. And we have thousands of customers, from enterprise scale down to startups and disruptors in the market that are relying on New Relic to help them manage their business and to deliver innovation and an excellent customer experience to their consumers. So with that, what I'd like to do is I'd like to flick over to questions and see whether there are any questions in the dialogue that need answering. David, could you tell us if we have any questions?
How you doing? Great job so far, Neil. So there's a couple of questions there that are around the recording in another webinar, so I can take them. So someone's asked if this webinar is being recorded. We just mentioned at the start, so maybe a few people came a bit late. So yes, we are recording this session, and the session will be available usually in about 2 or 3 hours once we finish. Anyone who has registered and or attended will get an email later on today or early tomorrow. Second question here is, do we have any webinars around the New Relic monitoring solution or APM solution? Yes, from time to time we do basic 101 APM webinars. So I suggest if you can subscribe to our webinar feed. So if you go on to the webinar section on newrelic.com, you can see a list of upcoming webinars. We host webinars on US time and also on EMEA time. We have some upcoming webinars taking place next week around Node.js, around browser. Also, we've done a lot of 101 APM webinars in the past. So any webinar we run, as I mentioned, we have a recording. So let me see what, I think a couple of more questions just popped in there. So one here from Zane. So I agree with you in regards to what DevOps is and isn't, but being a contractor, I'm still interviewed for a role of DevOps engineer, often within siloed DevOps teams. How do you think employees should be describing jobs requiring an engineer with a DevOps mindset? Is that something you've come across before, Neil?
It's certainly an interesting question. It's all about the job description, possibly more so than the job title. I think, as I mentioned, it was our view in terms of what DevOps is and what DevOps isn't, and our view is that it isn't a role and it isn't a title, right? But that may be different to some other organizations. From our perspective, it's a means to an end. Whether you're a DevOps engineer or an engineer, you're still an engineer. So I can't honestly say what the correct thing is. I would say it boils more down to the description of the role rather than necessarily the title.
Yeah, and Dana also had a follow-up question which is similar. So you mentioned site engineering team. How do you think DevOps differs from the SRE, the site reliability engineering? So you probably kind of cover that there as well.
Well, I think if I could just come on to that, I mean, sure. The site reliability engineer is somebody with an operational focus, but a development background or a programming background. I think one of the things which became apparent and has become apparent over the years is that the back-end technologies where we used to have really hardcore subject matter experts to do with the database and the networks and the app servers and so on. The level of knowledge that's required to run those systems has started to drop because they've become easier, they've become more intuitive. There's a larger pool. So what that now means is that people that are responsible for one area now have the bandwidth within their own capacity to be able to start to understand a little bit more, a little bit of a wider spectrum. And so, where we're seeing the site reliability engineer as being, somebody with an operations focus who also has a development background, we're also starting to see developers that have, understandings of databases, understanding of networking, and so on. So there's there's a little bit of a democratization of skills within the organization, and it's about bringing together those teams.
Great. Peter has a great question here. What do you think is the right ratio of dev to ops in a team?
I don't I don't know, to be honest with you, is the answer. It really depends upon uh, the team's objective and goals. They're going to vary very differently. You know, you might have something which is you know, fairly simple from a development perspective, but incredibly complex from an operational perspective, and vice versa. So I think you know, from the very beginning in the presentation, we talked about it's a business strategy that you're looking at rather than you know, a DevOps strategy. So whatever the business is trying to achieve, you need to build your teams accordingly to help them achieve that goal, and that's going to vary from one organization to the next.
Okay, great. We have a question here from Paul. How do you fill in the T-shaped model? Are software engineers stretched to infra or middleware engineers or vice versa? Or do you see this different?
I'm to be perfectly honest with you, that's out of my comfort zone in terms of being able to answer that question.
Okay. So we might, yeah, I might be able to find. We can maybe chase up someone to get an answer for Paul and I.
Yep.
Grant. Okay. So a couple more questions here. Again, if you have any other questions, just feel free to post them in. We have a question here from Michael. I assume you use your New Relic for monitoring all your systems, but do with site reliability engineers use any other tools to support this in addition to your NR tools?
We use a lot of tools, you know, like Slack, Jira, various other technologies out there to help us support the process. But in terms of the actual, you know, understanding the performance and availability, scalability, functionality of the applications that we deliver, then absolutely, that's New Relic.
Cool. We've a couple more questions here. One from Jurgen. And when giving developers more operations, tasks, and responsibilities, did you run into any lack of interest or pushback from developers? If so, how do you go about onboarding them?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Yes, you can get pushback. You know, I write code. I don't monitor. You know, that's all about fostering the right culture and removing, you know, the naysayers basically, and incentivizing the organization appropriately. So, you know, working with the development team to make sure that they're incentivized to do with the operational side of things as much as to do with the development side of things. But I mean, from my own personal role, where I'm talking to our customers, I'm constantly coming up against that, where, you know, you're having conversations to say, okay, how are you going to manage these applications in production? How are you going to monitor them? What are the KPIs which mean a difference? And you know, the development side is saying, well, you know, that's not our job. That's the monitoring team's job. So it's a common problem. Like I say, it's about, if you're going to create these teams, it's about trying to create a shared common goal and incentivize appropriately.
Great. We have one more question, and it's kind of related to the one we just asked. And before I ask that, I just want to, as you leave today, we do have a quick survey at the end. And as I mentioned at the start, the purpose of that survey is to give feedback on this session, some ideas for future sessions, and also if you want to sign up for a New Relic free 30-day demo, you can pop that in there. So the last question is from Harvey, and again, as I mentioned, it's quite similar. When you moved your SREs into the dev teams, did you identify a risk that those SREs will be expected to resolve all ops issues and allow the devs to just code? If so, how did you combat this?
Yeah, I think there is a risk. There's like, oh, we've got our own dedicated operations person. They can deal with all of that. We don't have to deal with it anymore. I think the key thing was that they went in as a peer to the engineers themselves, and we'd already, you know, built up that that mindset that, you know, the whole group has total responsibility. It's not, it's not one individual. The whole team has responsibility for everything to do with that application, whether it from the original development through to the deploy, operate, manage. It's probably we dealt with that beforehand through establishing that mindset early on.
Great. Okay, super. That's all the questions that have come in. I don't know if you want to have anything to say before we wrap up, Neil.
Well, there was one question that had come in previously, which was,
Yes.
how far down our journey are we on DevOps, and when do we think we will arrive? I mean, that's a really interesting question, because it's not a destination. I think it's constantly changing. It depends very much on our business and how our organization evolves as to where we go next. It's an approach, it's a methodology, and it's constantly evolving. So who's to say? Who knows what we need to do next? And I'm sure that it will be very similar for lots of you out there as you go down the journey. You're not necessarily going to have a destination in mind. You're just going to have things that you do along the way.
Great. Yeah, great question to end on. Okay, thanks, Neil, for the great webinar today. As a reminder, we will send a recording out, and just to fill in that survey. And we hope to see you at another webinar in the future. Thanks a lot, and have a good day.